Good morning to all of you. So, in the last class, we have completed the synthetic theory of evolution in detail. Almost I took 5 hours or 5 classes to complete that portion. And by the time I hope you know the synthetic theory of evolution, including the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Now, in the next step, we should study the speciation. That is the how a new species is formed. But before that, what I expect is we should also know what exactly meant by a species. Because unless we have some broad idea about the species and species concept, we will not be able to understand and appreciate what actually the speciation is, what are the different types of speciation. So that's why I think let us first complete the species concept and then move on to the speciation. As far as this species concept is concerned, we have discussed in brief already in the very first hour of BSc first semester. If you remember, prior to understanding the binomial nomenclature, we have also tried to understand what exactly meant by species. So today also, I would like to rebrush your memory with respect to what we have discussed in the previous year, and now we can move on to the uh, then we can move on to the speciation. First, let me start with the species concept, which is a very interesting thing. Species concept is a because why it is called as concept, because though we know that what is a species, we understand that we can give the characteristic feature to define anything as a species, but exact definition of the species is not possible. Of course, it is in fact against the uh, understanding of what we know the evolution against that. But for a common man and common students, it is also pertinent to know something about the species and uh, also know a definition of the species which is accepted by the majority, if not all. So that's why I have taken this species concept here, and basically all of you have one understanding that species is the basic unit of classification. At least being the student of biology, all of you remember this. Species is the basic unit of classification, and our classification ends with the species, though it starts from uh, the kingdom and then ends in a species. Um, it's a undoubtedly being the basic unit is also a rank. Species is a rank, and uh, there are so many methods, ways of understanding the species and even defining the species also. So, one most common definition we can say that species is a group of organisms. Either it may be plant or animal, but it should be a group of organisms. What group of organisms which are capable of interbreeding? Then not only interbreeding, but they should be able to produce a fertile offspring. So this is the mm, uh, most accepted. I don't say that it is absolutely accepted. Majority of the people accept this definition, and for the students also, this is the most uh, easy way of understanding the species. A group of organisms capable of interbreeding, not only interbreeding, they should be able to produce the offsprings which are also capable of reproducing. That means they are fertile offsprings. But remember, this definition is not an adequate. It's not an adequate definition, but uh, though it encompasses majority of the characteristic feature of the species, it is not the absolute definition of a species, because more precise and differing measures are also often used to describe the species. uh, because nowadays the species are defined or categorized based on the similarity of DNA, morphology, ecology. So different criteria have been used to define the species. So that's why even if you give any definition, you will be leaving one or two other characteristics. So that's why the reason I have told you we will not be able to define, give an absolute definition for a species. Uh, Even it has been also observed that a locally adapted traits may be further divided into many subspecies also. So that's why there's also one more definition. It's a separately evolving lineage that forms a single gene pool. It's a separately evolving, not together. There's one group which is evolving separately from rest of the groups, and the evolution leads to form a single gene pool for this newly evolved one. That's also another definition. But as far as the species definition is concerned, Ernst May's definition is most accepted definition. So what he says is species are the groups of interbreeding natural population. This you have to bear it in mind. So whenever you are, if suppose if you are asked to define a species, the best way is to give the definition is this definition. That's the definition that has been given by Ernst May. That the species are groups, groups of individuals. Not only groups of individuals, they are capable of interbreeding. They should interbreed among themselves. And it should be a natural population. That's also equally important. A group of individuals, group of natural population, otherwise we can also call it. It should be a natural population, not the artificial one. Natural population which is interbreeding, and at the same time they are reproductively isolated from other such groups. This group should be reproductively isolated from other such groups. There may be other groups which may be similar to this, but they should not interbreed with them. That means they are reproductively isolated group, and it should be a natural population, and they should be able to interbreed themselves. They should be able to interbreed among themselves, and at the same time they should isolate themselves from other such groups which from interbreeding. This is the most accepted definition what is given by the Ernst Mayr. Ernst Mayr has also given one more definition that is also very well read. Groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural population. They're the same thing. They should be actually. The individuals of a group are reproducing actually at the given point of time. Many times they may not be actually reproducing, but they have every potential of reproducing. Suppose think that there are two groups. They are not actually reproducing because they are separated. Suppose if they mix together, they can interbreed. That means they are potentially interbreeding, but maybe because of many other factors, they may not be doing at the given point of time. So that's why it's the group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural population, and at the same time, as I have told you, they are reproductively isolated from such groups. They should not carry out the reproduction with the other such groups. Uh, but why this definition, though it is most accepted, it is not an absolute definition. Why we have failed to define the species perfectly? Because though the Ernst-Mayr definition says they should be natural population, they should be interbreeding, they should be potentially or actually interbreeding, or they are isolated reproductively from such groups. Till then, here we have excluded so many other things. Unusual or artificial mating. Suppose if two organisms, they do not interbreed or mate naturally, but in a captive condition or in artificially, if they are able to reproduce, whether they should be called as same species or different species. The question. There are many hybridizations are going on in plants and so on. Then whether you call both of them as the same species or different species. So, and it is also seen that uh, there are few species which can reproduce in captivity or because of the human interference. Human interference. Then the question is whether we should consider them as the species or not. Even there are certain problems. Animals may be physically and physiologically capable of mating. They may be able to mate, but for various reasons, they do not normally do so in the wild, even in the wild or this thing. Maybe because of some height class differences. Because you take the example of dogs. A golden retriever dog is a very big dog, whereas Chihuahua is another breed of dog which is very small. Actually, a golden retriever will not be able to mate with the Chihuahua species, Chihuahua breed. Then what is that? They are physically they can do, physiologically they are capable, but because of the size class differences they cannot mate. So if such things happen in nature also, the example I have given is from the same species. In nature also this happens, and in that whether you call Chowa and golden retriever as one species or they are different species. So all these things are there. So that's why the defining or giving an exact definition to the species is is not within our limits. So, however, all our definitions, even what we have given for the species, even the Arshmere definition, it works out well with most multicelled organisms. Multicellular organism, it works out well, but there are several type of situation where the same definition fails. Uh, so here the definition applies to those organisms which can reproduce sexually. But whereas there are certain single-celled organisms which reproduce asexually, or there are certain organisms which reproduce as parthenogenetic organisms. The the phylotype. Then whether we can apply the same definition to this, the single-celled organism which undertake asexual reproduction, or parthenogenesis, or budding, and one more interesting fact. Our knowledge about the living kingdom, living world is very, very limited. We do not know the magnanimity of the biodiversity. So, we do not know whether two morphologically similar groups of organisms can undertake the interbreeding. Morphologically similar groups, remember. Physically, morphologically, for external appearance, they look alike. Whether they can undertake the reproduction or not. In many of the insects and smaller organisms, still now we do not know. So that's why, because of all these reasons, giving a perfect definition for species is very, very difficult. So there is a considerable variation in the degree to which hybridization may be succeeded under the natural condition. Now, in natural condition also hybridization takes place. Uh, then even we do not know the degree to which some organisms use sexual reproduction between individuals for the purpose of reproduction. When there's a scarcity of knowledge and information, there also this species concept or definition fails. There's also one more concept, ring species. Member of the adjacent population interbreed successfully. But members of some non-adjacent population do not. They are all same, looking same, morphologically same, physiologically same. One population can interbreed with the adjacent population. But if the same population is shifted somewhere away, they cannot reproduce with the non-adjacent population. In many cases, as I have told you, it is physically impossible for the animals that the members of the same species to mate. As I have told you, the difference in the size class and all. Or sometimes the breeding season varies. Breeding season of one local area differs from the other local area. Then whether they are able to reproduce, whether we call them as the same species, but they cannot reproduce because of the difference in the reproductive behavior. Even nowadays, horizontal gene transfer makes the definition more difficult. Horizontal gene transfer means what? The gene transfer between the two dissimilar groups, which we do not consider as a species, but gene transfer can be done. It's very common in prokaryotes, even in eukaryotes, occasionally it happens. One particular scientist, Williamson, he has shown the evidence that some crustaceans and echinoderms have shared the genes. When there's a gene sharing, now where this definition of species stands? Because the word species definition assume that organism gets all its gene from one or two parents that are very like that of that organism. But horizontal gene transfer makes that assumption false. How horizontal gene transfer can happen? Nowadays, of course, I'm not talking about the biotechnological tools which are used for horizontal gene transfer. Even naturally also, there are many times, as I have told you, the evidence of that, there are some crustaceans and echinoderms share the same gene. Even there are groups of organisms. In that group, individuals, if they conform to certain fixed properties, like rite of passage, or even the phenotypes within the species, would differentiate the species. For example, there is one group where the individual species they have certain fixed properties, say shorter tail or long tail, and that property is confined to that coherent cohort or that particular group. If you consider the tail size of this group and some other group, there will be drastic difference. Other group may be having very long tail, but this group may be having very short tail. Then whether to call both of them as separate species or the same species. Sometimes four-winged Drosophila takes birth to two-winged mother. In one, in the offspring, there are four wings, but the mother is having only two wings. Morphologically, such drastic differences you can observe. Then, how to classify them? Of course, nowadays we call it as morphospecies. It's a different thing, but whether they are species or not. So that's why I have told you there is no absolute definition possible for a species. But what we have given, the Erstmayer definition, is the most accepted definition, but it is not the absolute definition. Now, as far as the species definition is concerned, different schools of biologists define the species on their own way. We will try to understand some of those definitions given by definite school of or unique schools of biology. One is morphological species. A population or a group of population that morphologically differs from other population. We call it as morphological species. Externally, if you look, they look alike. A morphologist will define the species like this that differ morphologically from other population. For example, you will be able to differentiate between duck and chick based on this shape of the bill, feet. This is what we call solely based on the description of the morphological character and similarity of those morphological characters. We define a species. That is what we call morphological species. Then there is also one more, biological like that, biological or isolation species. What Ernst Mayr has defined is mostly the biological species only, because it is the actually or potentially interbreeding population. Actually and potentially interbreeding population. But the problem here is this definition perfectly fits into the higher taxa, like mammals, fishes, birds. But what about the organisms which reproduce asexually? Or whatever the artificial breeding that we are undertaking nowadays? This holds good only for a natural population. But what about the artificial population? But a biology will define the species like this. There's also one more, reproductive species, or it's also known as biological species. Two organisms that are capable to reproduce naturally, to produce fertile offsprings of both sexes. This is another definition, where the individual should be able to reproduce naturally. And the offspring should be fertile. Even offsprings thus produced should be able to reproduce. And offspring should produce both the sexes, male and female, and both of them should be able to reproduce. So this is what we call reproductive species. But the organisms that reproduce but always makes infertile hybrid, at least one sex. Whether this holds good or not. All of you know the cross between the horse and donkey results into mule or hinny, or F1 male cattle, whether to include here that or not. Then the recognition species based on shared reproductive system. That means one individual should identify the other individual as a potential mate because both of them should have same mating behavior. Where one individual recognizes the other individual as the potential mate because of its similar or same type of mating behavior. Such species are known as recognition species. This recognition species has been introduced by Patterson. If one individual recognizes the other as a potential mate because of the common mating behavior, then these two become same species. That is what we call recognition species. That is the mate recognition species, this is also known as. That is a group of organisms. They recognize one another as the potential mates. Again, this also applies to only those which reproduce sexually. Here it focuses specifically on pre-mating reproductive isolation. Sometimes two individuals will recognize them as potential mate, but the courtship behavior differs because it focuses specifically on pre-mating reproductive isolation. Because of the difference in the courtship behavior, they cannot mate. They cannot undertake the reproduction. Then whether to include them under mate recognition species or not, still it is a mystery. Then another one is evolutionary or Darwinian species. As per this evolutionary biologist, this is been given by evolutionary biologist. That's a group of organisms that share an ancestor, common ancestor. A group of organisms that share a common ancestor, a lineage that maintains its integrity with respect to the other lineages through both time and space. There should be a common ancestor. There should be a shared ancestor for all the individuals. There must be one common shared ancestor, and at the same time, this group should maintain its integrity with respect to other lineages, both space and time. But here the problem is, at some point of time, the evolution shown by such groups, some members again divert from the main population and evolve into subspecies. And this process of evolution of the subspecies eventually form a new full species if the isolation continues. Common ancestor, okay. Integrity with the lineage, okay. But in such groups, again, subspecies will form and subspecies will develop into new, totally new full set of species. This is what we call evolutionary or Darwinian species. Next one is phylogenetic or cladistic species. Undoubtedly, there's a respect to other lineages through both time and space. There is no interbreeding. But at some point of time during the progression of that group, they may diverge from one another. If the divergence becomes more and more intensified and sufficiently clear, results in the formation of two separate populations which are regarded as separate species. Now you may ask what the difference between this phylogenetic or cladistic species and uh, the evolutionary species. Evolutionary species. In evolutionary species, parent species goes extinct taxonomically. They become extinct when new species evolve. The mother and daughter population now forming two species. Mother population will extinct, only daughter population will continue. And subspecies are not recognized under this approach. But here, unlike this evolutionary species, parents will not die. Parents will have belong to one species, and offsprings will remain as another species, and they will also continue. Then ecological species. This species concept has been defined by ecologists. It's a set of organisms adapted to particular set of resources called niche. What is niche? Feeding and breeding ground in the environment. This is in order to avoid the competition. In order to avoid the competition, each organisms have their own niche. At least each species has their own niche. They are adapted to a particular set of resources. For example, in the water, there may be different species of fishes. In that, one may be mud dwellers, bottom one may be bottom dweller, another species may be column dwellers in the that is living in the column and feeding in the column only. One or two species may be the surface dwellers. They are found only on the surface water. That is their niche because they are adapted to particular set of resources. An ecologist will classify the species based on their niche, where we recognize as a species because ecological and evolutionary process. They control how the resources are being utilized by a population, how the resources are being divided up, thus producing clusters. As per this, the individuals which are sharing the same resource, they are one species. That is what you call ecological species. Then genetic species is the most recent and more modern one, which has been proposed by the geneticists. And this species definition is mainly based on the present day development in the field of genetics. Remember, genetic species, where based on the similarity of DNA of individuals or population. If two individuals are having similar kinds of DNA, both belongs to one species. Because nowadays the techniques are available to compare the similarity of DNA, either DNA hybridization, DNA fingerprinting, or DNA barcoding. There are different methods in the laboratory are made available. So if you find similarity with respect to DNA, we call it as genetic species. So because of the development in the DNA, even in the classification, in taxonomy, it has gone to molecular level where DNA analysts will suggest. It will also help us to understand the evolutionary process. So that's why DNA hybridization or genetic barcoding that helps us in understanding. And based on that similarity of the DNA, we can define the genetic species. Then the microspecies, very difficult to define. The species which reproduce without meiosis. All of you know the meiosis is for sexual reproduction. That means there is no fertilization at all. Species that reproduces without meiosis or fertilization. As a result, what happens? Each generation is genetically identical to the previous generation. Each generation is genetically identical, not similar, identical to the previous generation. Because only mitosis, where equational division has taken place, and both the parent and the daughter population, they are identical with respect to their genetic combination. Apomixis is an example. Amitosis, by the by means of amitosis, if they are able to reproduce, such individuals are known as microspecies. Because earlier definition, what we have discussed, holds good only for sexual reproduction, but not to this organism which reproduces without meiosis. Another species is known as quiescent species. This is a very interesting species definition. There are many inclusive populations of individuals where they have the potential for phenotypic cohesion through intrinsic cohesion mechanism. We can say that this is an extended version of mate recognition species which we have already studied. A population having the individuals of similar type, and they form this phenotypic cohesion through some inbuilt cohesion mechanism, where two individuals may undertake the reproduction, But after mating, there may be post-mating isolation mechanism. They do not. But during that, they have. So usually in hybrids, this happens. Whether this hybridization is successful or sometimes they can undertake the mating, but they fail to bring the hybridization. That means they fail to produce the fertile offspring. If they if they hybridize, then two individuals belonging to so-called two species may become one species. Or if they do not hybridize, if they are failed to produce the offspring, then they can undertake the reproduction, they can undertake the mating, but in spite of mating, they are still distinct groups. What is hybridization? Mixing of two gene pools. If the hybridization is 100% successful, then there will be only one gene pool because there's a mixing of gene pool and amalgamation of this gene pool. Suppose even after mating, if they remain separate, then we can say that hybridization is insufficient to mix the gene pools. So they will remain as two separate species. If hybridization is successful, then they become one species as far as this poison species is concerned. So this is what I wanted to discuss with you as far as the species concept is concerned. In brief, I hope this is what we have recapitulated because I have told you in the very beginning or in the first or second hour in the BSc first semester, we have discussed this species concept. So by this, what we have understood is first one is the species concept, a group of the one where we will not be able to define the species absolutely. Undoubtedly, the species are the fundamentals or basics of classification. As far as the species definition is concerned, there is no absolute definition, but the most accepted one is Ernst Mayr definition. That means a group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural population which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. This definition is the most accepted definition, but it is not a perfect definition. Because whatever the definition we put for the species, it absolutely holds good right for sexually reproducing individuals. But the same definition fails when it comes to the asexual reproduction, parthenogenesis, amitosis. So that's why I have told you it's not any definition is not perfect. Then we have also tried to understand how different schools of science have defined the species. So with this, this is some information with respect to the species and species concept. I hope you have understood what we have discussed. In ಅರ್ಥ ಆಯ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ವಾ ಹೇಳಿ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಯ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ವಾ ಎಸ್
ಅರ್- ಅರ್ಥ ಆಯ್ತು ಸರ್.
ಗೊತ್ತಾಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆಯಾ ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ
ಹೌದು
ಇದನ್ನ
ಸರ್.
ನಾವು ಸೇಮ್ ಇದನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಿ BSc ಒಂದು ನೆನಪಿದೆಯಾ ನಿಮಗೆ? ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಯು ಡೂ ಯು ರಿಮೆಂಬರ್? ಬಯೋಡೈವರ್ಸಿಟಿ ಆದ ನಂತರ ಬಯೋಲಾಜಿ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಇದು ಬೈನಾಮಿಯಲ್ ನೊಮೆನ್ಕ್ಲೇಚರ್ ಹೇಳೋ ಮತ್ತೆ ಇದನ್ನು ಡಿಸ್ಕಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡೇ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ವಿ ಶುಡ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಎ ಸ್ಪೀಸೀಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ದೆನ್ ಓಕೆ. After having understood about the species concept, now we will discuss the speciation. What is speciation? Formation of a new species in simple terms. Because evolution is visible only when there is a speciation. If there is no new species formation, we cannot believe in the process of evolution. So this speciation is nothing but the evolution of a new species. In the light of what we have learned over this last few weeks in evolution, we should be able to understand and appreciate the speciation. What is speciation? What are the different types of species? Before moving to actual speciation, I would like to draw your attention for two important things here. One is evolution is always visible when there is a speciation, new species are formed. Otherwise, it is very hard to believe whether speciation exists or not. But certainly, this act of speciation or process of speciation can take infinite number of days or weeks or years. Because in nature we have seen there are certain individuals which are not at all evolved since last few 100 million years. What you call the living fossils. Some fishes like Latimeria, they have not evolved at all since last few 100 million years. At the same time, you can see there are many examples where one species has given rise to series, has shown series of evolution. For example, the horse. Evolution starts with Hyracotherium, and they have represented in the form of present day horse equus. Why this is so? Why some evolve, some do not evolve? Some takes only a very short duration of period to evolve, whereas others do not show any evolution even after hundreds of millions, 100 millions of years. What must be the reason? Why it must be like that? Now the question comes whether the evolution is visible to us. Because while studying the natural selection, I have told you, natural selection is a continuous process. But at the same time, it's a very slow process also. It's a continuous process, but it's a slow process. Meanwhile, the mutation can be the faster way of speciation, both chromosomal as well as the point mutations. In the light of all this information that we have gathered, we have to discuss about speciation. What are the factors which work for speciation at the certain level? What kind of mechanism process helps the evolution? So this all we will discuss that in the next class and the speciation.